In this video, I'm going to take you through the process of setting up this twisting shape effect in Blender. It's very easy to work with and surprisingly simple to set up. And I think it's a really cool effect. And I want to say thanks to everyone who's working really hard on developing Blender. It's an amazing software and it's just incredible that it's free. I'll be working in Blender version 2.82 Alpha. But before we start, head over to the render properties and change the render engine from Eevee to Cycles. So this cube is going to be our core element in this project. To edit this cube, we'll go into edit mode. You can either do that in the top left corner or you can press tab. We're going to scale the cube on the x-axis. So press S and then X to specify the axis. It's important to use the x-axis because it just makes it a lot easier to work with the modifiers we're going to be using. Now to get back to object mode, we can either go in the top left corner again, or you can press tab to cycle back and forth between edit mode and object mode. Now we're going to twist our mesh, and we're going to do it by using a modifier. So to the right, click this little icon called Modifier Properties. And if you click Add Modifier, we're going to select Simple Deform Modifier. And we can already drag this slider and our mesh will twist. The problem here is that we need more vertices to twist this properly. Right now it's just a cube. So go back into edit mode and the hotkey we're going to use is Ctrl+R. Then you can just scroll on your scroll wheel to increase the amount of vertices. Press left click, then right click. Go back to object mode and now when we twist our mesh it looks much better. So let's change the name to core. And if you like, you can delete the other objects in the scene by just right-clicking and selecting delete. So the next step is to make this core follow a curve. So let's collapse this modifier and add another modifier called curve. And under object, okay, so we're going to have to add the curve first. So press Shift A and select Bezier curve. And nothing happens. But we just added the curve. So where is it? So the curve is actually just hidden inside the mesh right now, because it's just too small. So you can toggle X-ray, and now we can see the curve. So to scale up the curve, press tab to go into edit mode, and then just scale it up by pressing S. Press tab to go back to object mode again, and you can turn off X-ray if you like. And now under object, we have our Bezier curve. And now you can see that the mesh is following the path of the curve. To edit the curve, go to edit mode, and then you can select a control point and hit R to rotate. To make the curve longer, you can right click on one of the control points and hit extrude and move. This will make a new segment that is following your cursor, and you can rotate and move this around. The hotkey for this is E. So our workflow to create this curve path will be to just press E and move your cursor, and then you can rotate each control point. One of the most interesting features about the curve modifier is that if you move a mesh that has the curve modifier on it, it will sort of follow the curve, but only on a specific axis, and this is going to be the x-axis. So if you move the mesh on the x-axis, it looks really cool. It's following the curve. And here's a cool trick. If you press N to bring up this properties panel, we can go ahead and lock the Y and Z axis. So when you press G in the viewport, the mesh automatically follows the curve because it can't move on anything else than the x-axis. Now we want to make our core twist as it's following the curve. So we have to open up our simple deform modifier again. And then you set the origin for the twist modifier to be the curve itself. Now that we move the mesh, it will actually twist by itself. And we can increase the amount of twisting so it's easier to see that this is rotating around its own axis while following the curve path. I want to try and make this into a more aerodynamic shape. So go to edit mode and to deselect your mesh, press Alt-A. Then we're going to select the first 4 vertices of the mesh. You can either do this by holding Shift and clicking them individually, or you can choose vertices, edges, or faces. And the hotkey for this is just 1, 2, or 3. So make sure this face is selected and press S to scale. And we want to make some sort of gradient scaling here. So to scale down more than just this first face, at the top here you can select proportional editing. So now when we hit S to scale our mesh, it will be proportionally scaling along the entire shape. But we want to scale it on all axes except for the x-axis. So press S and then Shift X. And then use your scroll wheel to increase or decrease the radius of the proportional editing. And then when you found the perfect size, just press 0 and it will just snap to 0. Now let's select the other side of the mesh. S and Shift X. Scroll down and press 0. Then I want to make the entire mesh a little bit slimmer, so press A to select everything, and then S, Shift X. And then we can just press S to scale up everything. And now we have a shape that is much more aerodynamic, and I really like this shape a lot better. But I want to make this more interesting by duplicating our shape. So we can use this tool in the top right corner to navigate our scene. So let me just adjust my view here. We can do this by pressing the X icon here to watch it from right orthographic view mode. So make sure your entire mesh is selected. Go to Mesh, Duplicate. And as you can see, the hotkey for that is Shift D. So press Shift D to duplicate the mesh, and then you can hold Control to snap it to the grid. And in the top left corner, you can see how many meters we are working with. So let's go -2 by 2 meters. Then duplicate it one more time and hold Control. And then to get it symmetrically, choose 4 meters. Now we have duplicated our mesh into 3 pieces, but I want 5 pieces. So if we hover the cursor over the other object, you can press L to select it. Now go back to right orthographic view and press Shift D to duplicate both of these. You can still hold Control and snap this to the grid, and let's do -4 meters. Now we have 5 pieces of equal size that will twist around and follow the curve. And we can still change the shape of our curve whenever we want. And if something's weird, make sure you have turned off proportional editing. So right now, this is an interesting shape, but we can customize it even further. So go back into edit mode and deselect by pressing Alt A and press L to select the mesh in the middle. Then you can scale this up by pressing S. And now we have a bigger streak in the middle and smaller at the outside. I want to tweak this a little bit more, so press Ctrl I to select inverted. And to scale this down, I'll go S and Shift X to scale it down on all axes except from the X axis. And then to duplicate and rotate at the same time, press Shift D and R. And then you can hold Ctrl to make it snap. Now scale this up, pressing S and Shift X. Now, when I'm scaling these, they're all scaling, but I want to scale them individually. So let's change the pivot point to individual origins. And now when you press S, Shift X, we can actually control the thickness of the particles. But now when you rotate, they still have their individual origins. So select pivot point and set it back to median point. And now you can press Shift D and rotate the particles around and hold Control to make it snap. And as you can see, our mesh is still following the curve perfectly. I want to move these particles back a little bit. So when you're in edit mode, by pressing L, you can select all these outer streaks and just move them back on the X-axis. You can also hold Control here to snap them to the grid. Then deselect everything by pressing Alt A and select the inner streaks. Now we have shifted the position of the streaks a little bit, and it's all a matter of flavor by now. So make sure you make something that you think looks cool. Now we're going to add our camera. So go to Shift A and select Camera. And then in the top left corner, you can select View, Align View, and Align Active Camera to View. And the hotkey for that is Control Alt Numpad 0. And then to control the camera, I like to use View, Navigation, Walk Navigation. And this is basically like a first-person shooter game. So you can just use WASD on your keyboard, and then you can use scrolling on your mouse to change the speed. And this is a really precise and easy way to control the camera in Blender. To split the viewport in half, select this line at the bottom here and right-click on it. Then select Vertical Split. Then you can press this camera icon to make this view be the camera view. To split it again, right-click on this vertical line and select Horizontal Split. So, we're going to change this top right panel to Graph Editor. The Graph Editor allows you to see the keyframes that we're going to create when we will be animating our core. So to animate our mesh, press I for Insert, and then Location. Now we have created a keyframe for the location value. So let's go to 100 frames, and then we can move our particle a little bit, and make a new keyframe by pressing I, and then Location again. And here we can see our keyframes. And you can hold down Control and middle mouse button to do this weird scaling thing. You'll get used to it. So right now we're working in 24 frames per second, and it's a little bit choppy. So we want to increase the frame rate. So let's say you want to increase the frame rate to 30 frames per second. To the right, you can head over to Output Properties and set the frame rate to 30. Now it's going to play a little bit smoother. So right now our timeline is longer than the animation. So go to the last keyframe, and in the bottom left corner you can select Playback and press Set End Frame. So now that we have set up our camera, we can go ahead and customize our curve path even further. So I really like that it's kind of moving in 3D space a little bit more. So I'm not quite happy with the motion here. It starts slow and it goes fast and it goes slow again. We can change that by setting our keyframe handle type to vector. So now the effect will have the same speed all the time. But I want it to start outside the camera and then come in. So you can just press G and move it outside of the frame, and then make a new keyframe by pressing I and Location. And now the keyframe will be updated. Same thing goes for the exit. I want it to exit the frame. So I'm going to have to extend the curve a little bit. So now we can move the mesh outside the camera and make a new keyframe. So I'm happy with the motion for now. How do we render this? We don't need the graph editor anymore. So let's go ahead and change this panel to shader editor. And if you want, you can start by just getting this out of the way. And this principled BSDF node is quite comprehensive, so we're not going to be using that for now. So just go ahead and delete that. Press Shift A, shader, glass. To connect these, just drag from the output of the glass shader and into the material surface. But nothing happens. And that is because we have to set our viewport shading to rendered. And this doesn't really look good right now. Even if you turn off overlays, you can see that there's not much going on here. There is a glass material, but we need to have a light source. So in the 3D viewport, press Shift A, Mesh, and a plane. And then you can just scale this plane up. You don't have to go to edit mode for this. Just press S and scale the plane up, and then let's move it above our mesh. And right now, this didn't change anything. So make sure the plane is selected. Click here to make a new material. And let's rename this to lamp top. So you can delete this node by pressing X. And to give this an emission material, go to Shift A, Shader, Emission. And then we'll do the same thing again, where we'll drag the output from the node into the surface of the material. Now we can see that our material is actually looking a little bit like glass, but the entire world is really gray. So to the right, you can go to World Properties, and in the surface, you can set the color to black. And now we have a much more contrast-filled image. But we can still see the lamp in our viewport. And we want to make the lamp hidden from camera, but visible in the reflection of the glass. So to the right, go to Object Properties, and under Visibility, you can turn off the ray visibility for the camera. And it's also a nice habit to turn off the shadow. So we want to add another light source, and the easiest way to do that is just to duplicate the lamp that we have. So go to Object and Duplicate Objects, which is Shift D, and set the axis to Z. So we're moving it straight down. And now we have a lot more light hitting our mesh, which is cool. But the mesh is kind of hard. We want to make it smoother. We want to increase the amount of polygons in the mesh. So the first step to make it smooth is to just right click on it, and you can set the shading to smooth. But it's still a little bit wonky because we need to have a higher amount of polygons here. So let's go to the right to the modifier properties. And we can collapse these two. And then go to Add Modifier and select Subdivision Surface. So let's set the subdivision viewport to 2. And now our mesh is a lot smoother. If you hold your mouse over the active panel, you can press Ctrl Space to full screen it. So in my opinion, the mesh just got too smooth. I want to keep some of the structure that allows you to see that it's actually twisting. And a nice way to do this can be to add a bevel modifier. But it's just making this weird boxy patterns. And we can fix this by just swapping the position of the subdivision surface modifier and the bevel modifier. Let me just get some more space here. So click this little arrow. And in my opinion, this shape is a lot more interesting. And there's some weird stuff going on here that it's a little bit hard to explain, but I can recommend that you set this limit method to angle. And then we can set the angle to, for example, 70 degrees. So to make this faster to work with, you can set the viewport subdivision to 1. If you still want to make it look really good when you're rendering, you can set the render quality to 3. Now that we have a smoother looking mesh, the resolution of our curve is too low. You can actually see the individual lines in the curve. So select the curve, and to the right, select these curve properties and set the resolution preview to a much higher number, for example 64. And now the curve is a lot smoother, and this makes the movement of our shape smoother as well. So now I want to add some colors to this glass material. We want to make like a custom color gradient that allows you to specify where you want the colors to be. So to do this, we'll go into the shader editor. Make sure your mesh is selected, press Shift A, and add a texture called Gradient Texture. And then you take the color from this texture into the color of the glass material. And right now, this texture is just a black and white gradient. So to customize these colors, we'll use a color ramp. So press Shift A and go to Converter, Color Ramp. And then just drag it in the middle and it will automatically connect. We want to add colors along the way of this shape. You can take, for example, this black color and change it to be something else. And then we can take the white color and change that to be something else too. And now we have a color gradient. And then you can move these points around. And this color ramp effect is really powerful. Let's zoom in here. If you press the plus sign, you can add more points and give that a different color too. Now I think this scene is too dark. So we can select our lamp and increase the strength of our emission node. So let's try and set it to 3 or 5 or maybe 12, 15. Now I think it looks a lot better. Now I want to see what this looks like when it's rendered. So in the top left corner, go to Render and Render Image. I want to make the light source bigger. So hold Shift and select both lamps and press S and let's scale it up on the X-axis. And then we can move these around by pressing G and Z. You can also rotate the lamps. And I want to try and move them behind a little bit too. Now we did some changes and I want to compare this to our previous render. So go to Render and View Render. So we're currently on render slot 1, but if you select render slot 2, that slot is empty. So set it to render slot 2. And then we render another image. We can compare render slot 1 and render slot 2. And you can also do this by pressing 1 and 2 on your keyboard. And this is such a nice way to see the difference between the previous versions. So right now, when we're changing the material, we are changing the material of every part of our mesh. So to separate our mesh, to add different colors to the different streaks, go to Edit Mode, and then hover your mouse over and press L on the different pieces that you want to separate. And then go to Mesh, Separate by Selection. And the hotkey for this is P, so you can press P to separate by selection. Go back into object mode, and now we have our core separated from the streaks around it. So let's go ahead and rename these. Select the streaks, and under Material, you can click this tiny button called New Material. And let's give this a name. And now we can customize this material. And now that we have separated our mesh, we can actually change the twisting level for each of the elements. So if you go to the modifiers, you can change the angle, and it's going to have a different rotation than the streaks surrounding it. So let's, for example, set this to -200, then select the streaks and set it to -100 or -150. So we can separate these streaks even further by going back into edit mode, and then let's select these 4 big ones. And then press P to separate by selection. Now we can take, for example, the smallest streaks and change this. We can even give them a positive value so they spin the other way. So let's set them to 150. And now we can compare our renders. So all these renders are a little bit noisy. You can zoom in and you can see these tiny grains of noise. And these were rendered at 128 samples. So to add a denoiser, go to Layer Properties and enable Denoising Data. And then set the editor type to compositor. And when you click Use Nodes, you can see a different kind of node tree. Let's separate this a little bit because we're going to be putting a denoise node in the middle. Press Shift A and then just search for denoise. And then you can add this in the middle and connect the noisy image to image, connect the denoising normal to normal, and connect the denoising albedo to albedo. This doesn't change anything right now because you have to re-render, which is F12. So now when we cycle through these different renders, you can see that the denoised version has a lot less noise. So to render this as a video file, go to Output Properties, and under Output, set the file format to FFmpeg video. Then under Encoding, I want to change the container from Matroska to QuickTime. And then under Video, you can set the output quality to high quality if you want. Then click this little folder icon to specify the output path. And I like to make a new folder that is dedicated to the render. And this is also really smart when you're working with image sequences. So now that you have your animation, you can go to Render, Render Animation. And it's going to start render into your output folder. To see the final result of your render, go to Render, View Animation. And there it is.